Hey everybody, welcome to Midas Letter Daily. Today is Tuesday, January 11th, and big stories in markets today. We're following, obviously, the market moving story of the day is Jerome Powell's testimony before the Senate committee this morning as he seeks a second term as Fed chairman. And by all accounts, he pulled off a brilliant speech, and markets rallied despite the fact that he basically promised 4 rate hikes this year and reduced stimulus. So almost as if on cue, the CEOs of most of the central banks, the CEOs of the largest accounting firms in the world were all on parade today at CNBC, Wall Street Journal, Yahoo Finance, you name it. The collective willpower for delusion in the United States is absolutely spectacular. Jamie Dimon said that the consumer balance sheet has never been in better shape, and the U.S. is headed for the best economic growth in decades. You can't expect these people to say anything else. They are part of the tier 1 cabal of banks that are obliged to buy treasuries at every auction, and therefore, of course, they're going to sing the praises of the economy, and that's to be expected. 4 rate hikes in a year, culminating with a target of somewhere above 2.5%, is probably going to cause a lot of hardship to families who are behind on mortgage payments, have been relying on the forbearance caused by the pandemic to avoid getting kicked out of their homes. What else is interest rates going up going to do? It's going to make the cost of borrowing higher. So all of the S&P 500 companies and the Dow Jones companies who have been buying back their stock using cheap money as a way to drive their share prices higher, which is part of the intention of the Fed's continuous stimulus, that is going to look less attractive to CEOs now. And if you were to try to interpret what's being said between the lines, it strikes me that the Fed and the powers that be in the U.S. financial system have this sense that they have sufficiently flooded the financial system with capital, that the wealth effect that they sought to create has now caused a surplus of capital in the system that won't soon flush out. And so therefore they've sort of created a self-perpetuating money machine, and they expect that markets will continue to trend higher, that just the money in the system, liquidity in the system, will continue to drive markets higher. Why raise rates? Well, we're expecting to see a 7% inflation number after 6.8% reported last month, 7% for the last month of 2021. And so interest rates rising now is a negative for market prices, I think. And all these rosy predictions on the parts of the mandarins of the U.S. financial system predicting economic growth and the economy ready to bounce back is hugely misleading, in my opinion, especially considering the pandemic is not something that you can just wish away and pretend it's not there. 3,000 flights canceled today by airlines in the United States, obviously, as a byproduct of trying to pretend that the pandemic is over when it's not. Flight crews calling in sick, pilots calling in sick, causing the delays and cancellations of flights. Just a symptom of possibly worse to come. But anyways, let's take a look at our markets here today and see where we're at here on the end of the day on this Tuesday, January 11th. Obviously, looking at the 10-year rate in government's bonds, a little bit of a lull here. Late in the day, dropped to 1.74% despite the promise of higher rates to come. Amazon sort of trading sideways at the end of the day here. This is the hour by hour look here. After gaining pretty solidly on the news. This is aftermarket trading here. So it saw a rise from 31.42 when Jerome Powell started to speak to close the day up here at 33.04, now bouncing along sideways in aftermarket. Apple, same thing, saw a big rise. So the market is attempting to transmit to participants that the 4 rate hikes and the reduction in stimulus is a good thing. And this is the market manipulation by the forces behind the markets, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all pulling out all the stops to paint the tape rosy black today. And I don't know, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But one thing is certain, the United States is determined to put on a bold and happy face in the face of all of the negative influences or the negative catalysts in the marketplace coming in 2022. Which negative catalysts am I talking about? Well, let's start with a look at commodities. So copper obviously responded favorably to Powell's statements, but this is also part of the coordinated effort on the part of the banking system in the United States to project a rosy picture. Copper up to 445. Now, raising interest rates is precisely the action that is undertaken to try to drive commodity prices lower. Commodity prices being the fundamental driving force behind inflation. If commodity prices rise, goods are more expensive to manufacture, and those prices are passed along to consumers, which forms the basis of consumer inflation. So if you look at just the trading action in commodities, one would have to conclude that there's really no effect on commodities. Commodity prices going higher. Yeah, okay, so at the end of the day, overnight yesterday, commodity copper prices dropped in Asia. But then this morning, then they started to bounce back late in the day in Asia. Starting at 6 a.m. here. Here's today. Here's where Jerome Powell spoke. The takeaway is that copper prices are going to continue to rise. Lumber prices. So lumber prices rising, indicative of of optimism for the housing market and an expectation that inventories of lumber will be under pressure this year as the lack of standing timber in forests causes a price increase. Let's see, what else? Gold. Gold actually demonstrating a positive reaction to the Fed's announcement of reduced stimulus and increased interest rates. Typically, interest rates are not the friend of gold. However, in the case of the economy dragging on like it has been, rising interest rates might actually turn out to be good for gold. Bitcoin, let's take a look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin also responded favorably to Powell's remarks. Also, this is indicative of the fact that the hash power, the loss during the Kazakhstan crisis, which has now been suppressed. If you like the show, you'll love our website. Visit us at www.midasletter.com for interviews with key CEOs, cannabis news, and to subscribe to our newsletter. Okay, so some of you are commenting on my statement about in regards to Newran Wireless last week, where I mentioned that they have over 5,000 sites. They do. They have 5,000 sites designated, spec'd out that they are going to be putting towers on. They don't have 5,000 sites operational at this point. They're far less than 1,000, less than 500 at this point, I believe. but they have 5,000 sites in development in partnership with Orange and with Spacecom throughout DRC and Cameroon, Sierra Leone, etc. So yeah, that was not a slip up, unless I made it sound like there was 5,000 sites active. They're not active yet, but they are building 5,000 sites. You can find that in the press releases and statements of the company over the last year. So Joseph P. asked, do you think there will ever be any recourse for the pumping influencers and celebrities do when they promote their NFTs, shitcoins, etc.? Well, there's just so many people promoting what shitcoins and NFTs out there that go up in flames in like, I've looked at a few charts of some of them that basically come out and go to zero like in 24 hours. There's too many to talk about. So are there going to be repercussions? I got to think it's just a matter of time till the SEC starts looking for people to be made examples of. And certainly a lot of these celebrities who allow their franchises to be used to promote NFTs because they obviously get some cash dangled in front of them are going to regret that, because chances are they'll never collect anything, and their reputation will take a hit. So yeah, I think there's absolutely going to be recourse in the form of reputational damage. And in the case of the most egregious examples of influencers and celebrities promoting multiple failed cryptocurrencies, and if you're wondering what a shitcoin is basically a cryptocurrency that comes to market and basically goes to zero and wipes out all of its investors. Trippy Willie wants to know, as you have talked to the majority of psychedelic CEOs, do you have a sense of how well the sector will perform in 2022? And do I have a favorite? Trippy Willie, I have a couple of favorites. COMPASS Pathways has been my favorite because they were first to sort of make public traded company. Field Trip is one of my favorites just because I find that Ronan Levy's leadership of the company is exemplary, and I think it's going to do well. And Numinous is probably the smallest cap one that is one of my favorites, just because I have a good sense about what they're doing with their ketamine clinics and everything. So yeah, will the sector generally perform well in 2022? I think this is much like the cannabis industry. This is where favorite cliche word that people like to throw around. I'm no different. Bifurcate. Divide into two groups. The groups that report profit will obviously see their share prices rise. The groups that continue to raise money and deliver nothing might not do so well in their share price. So basically, yeah, that's what I'm going to be focusing on 2022, is trying to identify the companies that are going to demonstrate some income. So as a sector on the whole, I don't think you can categorize the sector on a whole because it is going to separate into these two groups. But the companies that do well are going to do well. That's probably not too helpful. Dick Gerald wants to know, has the taper announcements been priced into the current stock market value? What is the likelihood we will see taper tantrum sell-off in 2013? Well, as you saw today with Jerome Powell talking the market up, and the Pavlov's dogs a la Jamie Dimon and different CEOs like that, dutifully deploying their stimulus dollars to buy stocks and drive the market higher. I think that's going to wear off, and I think with the companies, as they start to announce the reining in of stock buybacks as a result of rising interest rates, that's going to cause people to look for greener pastures. Tech stocks are just so overvalued. I mean, I would say that 80% of the value in tech stocks stems from the stimulus that has been pumped into the market and fractionally banked out since 2009. And at some point, there's going to be a comeuppance, as we often say. And so, no, I don't think the taper tantrum's been priced into the market adequately. I think that we're going to see a big sell-off in 2022, and that the Fed has painted itself into a corner. It has to raise interest rates to offset the effects of inflation. However, pulling in stimulus at the same time as rising interest rates is basically akin to pulling the methadone away from a junkie just as he's starting to make strides in recovery and sending him back to the street to get high. That's basically the analog that I see. Kaz wants to know, since the FOMC news leaked, do you think it's more buy the rumor, sell the fact will be in play when the actual interest rates are hiked in a few months? I think there's some disbelief on the parts of market participants that the Fed will not be able to raise rates because the economic effects of Omicron, etc., are going to continue to affect the market. Stonks and Scotch. Ooh, I love the handle. What will be the effects of rate hikes in the tech sector, and why are we having such an insane volatility seesaw? Yeah, well, rate hikes rise, stocks, companies stop buying their own stocks. Leverage costs more, so the value proposition for funds that use leverage to gain exposure to the tech sector is diminished. So particularly the relationships between using leverage to buy more stocks because the rate of return on stocks is much higher than the cost of leverage, that whole sort of value proposition starts to go like this a little bit. The seesaw flattens because the companies buying stocks, which drives up their prices, is diminished. And at the same time, the cost of leverage goes up slightly. So the expectation for stocks to outperform is diminished, and the cost of leverage goes up. So that's why the volatility. And it'll be interesting to see what happens when the first rate hike actually happens. They've already kicked in with the reduction of tapering, so we'll see what happens. If you're enjoying the show, subscribe to Midas Letter on YouTube so you stay up to date on everything investment. One of the areas that Jerome Powell talked about today was that he expected the supply bottlenecks to return to normal. Yet here on front page of the Wall Street Journal today, they report that China COVID-19 lockdowns have hit factories, ports in the latest knock to supply chains. So while we've got Jerome Powell telling the Senate that he expects supply chain issues to be resolved this year, we've got China, source of most of the imports in the United States, clearly suffering from an increase in the causes of supply chain issues. And don't forget that Jerome Powell's entire discourse today is based on an expectation that the coronavirus pandemic is somehow going to be brought under control, or that we're just going to live with it. Now, I would like to suggest that it's been 3 years of the coronavirus now, and what we do know about this coronavirus is that it has this amazing capacity to mutate and become something else. And it's basically becoming more infectious while becoming less deadly. And that has been the case certainly with this Omicron, though hospitalizations are now higher in the United States than they have been at any other point in the pandemic. Now, to me, that suggests that this interpretation that Omicron is milder does not hold water, because if there are more vaccinated Americans than ever before, yet Omicron has caused more hospitalizations than ever before, then how does that equate to a less virulent strain? It doesn't, in my view, and I think that 2022 is very much going to be another year of let's wait and see what happens. If we follow the same trend that we saw in the last few years, which means that come spring, the infection rate automatically goes down as warmer weather brings people outdoors and they spend less time indoors. Summer weather is obviously less infectious for the pandemic, or less infectious period for the virus. So, that is going to result in the talking heads of the planet interpreting the natural sort of recession of the virus as indication that the pandemic is over. And then as we basically predicted last year during the summer, while everybody was saying, oh, it's time to go back, that, no, wait till flu season and there will be a new variant, and the variant will take down huge portions of the economy, and that's exactly what happened. So there is zero reason at this point to expect that there's going to be any other pattern come the end of 2022. So despite all of the rosy and optimistic statements by Jerome Powell, I don't really see any reason to expect there to be anything less than a new variant to look forward to in 2022, and a new round of vaccinations. There's rising discontent with the restrictions socially, with the economic restrictions socially. So, I mean, these variants are going to have free rein to spread wildly. Anyways, if you're as tired as talking about the pandemic as I am, I apologize, but I just can't handle it when I see Jerome Powell droning on about how he's got everything under control. This is all good. Anyways, my guest today, none other than George Goldsmith from COMPASS Pathways. If you haven't been following the COMPASS Pathways story, they have basically taken the active ingredient in magic mushroom, psilocybin, and isolated as a compound, and are using it to treat treatment-resistant depression. So, some good news from George. I spoke to him just a little bit earlier today from Ibiza in Spain. George Goldsmith, CEO of COMPASS Pathways, trading on NASDAQ under the symbol CMPS, rejoins us for an update. George, how are you?
I'm doing really well. So nice to be with you again. And before we get started, I just want to mention that we are going to make some forward-looking statements in this conversation and refer people to our entry on the SEC website.
George, recently you announced that COMP360 psilocybin study of 89 healthy participants was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. Why don't you give us an overview of the significance of that and what it means for the shareholders in COMPASS Pathways?
Sure. Actually, because of the nature of publication, this study was done almost 2 years ago. But however, it's now published in a very reputable peer-reviewed journal. This is what's called a phase 1 study. It was with healthy volunteers. And as you know, despite all the hype about psilocybin and so forth, there are very few actually large randomized controlled trials. This one at the time it was conducted was the absolute largest ever done in 60 years. And that trial really was looking at, are there any kind of cognitive or emotional challenges that can come up through taking psilocybin? It's really about safety. And you start that in all clinical development with healthy volunteers, then you move to patients. But we knew that the results would probably be fairly benign, as they proved to be. But we did also want to explore some other things, because as we move forward in the real world, I think we have to really look at the model of delivery, because the problems are so huge. Sadly, so many people are depressed, so many people struggle, and even just in the area of so-called treatment-resistant depression, these people are very ill, 2 to 4 failures of prior medicines, often struggling with depression for years. Even though that's so severe, there are tens and tens of millions, almost 100 million of those worldwide. So the first question is, how do you serve those? Let's assume that actually psilocybin therapy does meet the safety and efficacy needs of regulators, and our product is of the highest quality. Well, then what? And so this study was really designed to look at how we could experiment with different models of delivery. Historically, in the 60s, and even in some of the studies over the last 10 years, the traditional model is to have 2 psychotherapists and a single patient. And we felt that that was perhaps certainly nothing that could work to scale to the problem. So the first thing we did in this study was look, could we do one-to-one support, and would that be safe for patients? And we can say resoundingly yes. So that's a really important issue as we move into the world of first showing that with healthy volunteers. Recently, we announced a study that was done with the Aquilino Cancer Center in cancer patients, and there we used one-on-one support also. The second thing we tried in this healthy volunteer study was what we refer to as simultaneous administration. So this was done at the UK National Health Service in a clinical research unit. Think of a kind of a ward. We had 6 beds, a chair by side each one. It was lots of LED candles, and we made the room calm and quite peaceful. But we had up to 6 people having a psilocybin session in the same room with a therapist each. And they were on 3 doses, a placebo dose, absolutely nothing sugar pill, 10 milligram and 25 milligram. And what we were really doing was demonstrating safety as we went into the phase 2B study that we just announced. And what we found in this healthy volunteer study is that largely very benign safety perspective. About 68% of all the things that came up for people disappeared after the psilocybin the next day. And the most common thing was headache. So I think this was kind of what we expected and we confirmed. But the really interesting thing is there were really no issues other than some reduced anxiety on the part of people when we did it simultaneously. So that was an interesting finding. And then lastly, we also found that the one-on-one, people, there weren't any safety issues that couldn't be addressed, any concerns on the part of patients, even in the high dose conditions, that needed to be addressed in a different way. So the model really worked. And it was one therapist per patient and then an overseeing psychiatrist who could help. So this is really just portending what the future can look like. And that's why it's so important. How do we deal with getting this to the scale it needs to be? And then obviously we take that evidence and we go to regulators and say, this is what happened in healthy volunteers. Can we now look at doing this in patients? And so everything that happens in regulation, I'll shut up finally, is like a stair step, right? So you first do healthy volunteers and you demonstrate, and then you go to the next step, which is the more vulnerable population, patients. Then you demonstrate it there, and you progress until you have a body of evidence that says, this works, it's safe, it seems to generate effective response in this kind of patient, and you move on. And that's what the real significance was. It's a new model. And we didn't see any kind of cognitive or emotional deficits or frankly benefits, So, these patients healthy volunteers were, very talented, a lot of students and so forth. So there wasn't a lot of place for them to improve. So that's what we learned.
I have a relationship with a young individual who is, struggling to somewhat. And so the requirement for psilocybin treatment in the mental health realm is self-evident to me.
That's how we started, actually, with a family issue, and it's all too prevalent. Everyone has a story.
Right. Well, and it's interesting in my case because the individual in question has some experience recreationally with psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, and so when I suggested that a way forward might be to explore some psychedelic research as a study participant, he said, no, I've been down that road. And I said, yeah, but you're doing mega doses to achieve a hallucinogenic effect, and you're not taking a therapeutic approach with a measured dose in a clinical environment that's got a therapist present to guide your thinking and your emotional sort of reaction to this. So anyways, got them halfway talked into it, I like to think, and so it'll be interesting to see. But I'm curious as to how how widespread is the knowledge among mental health professionals worldwide at this point of the efficacy that is being demonstrated in trials like yours, of the ability of psilocybin to treat certain mental illness issues like depression?
So it's a great question of, do people really know about the promise of psychedelic therapy for depression? I think we have to be really kind of cautious at this point. We've just done the largest study that's ever been done in psychedelics and psilocybin, specifically with depression. 233 patients, 22 sites, 10 countries, 7 different languages, all different therapists trained and so forth. And what we found was remarkable and cautionary. The remarkable bit was after a single dose, no one was on any antidepressants, everyone came off antidepressants, very controlled fashion. And after a single psychedelic experience with COMP360 psilocybin therapy, which was a couple preparation sessions, a session of having the psilocybin in a very quiet, calm environment, and some follow-up. What we found was 25% of patients, a remarkable number, were in remission at the end of the 12 weeks. This is something that's never been seen before, a single dose leading to that type of response. Now, here's the issue. 75% didn't have that response. And so this fits very well with the study that was done at Imperial College in London in 2016, where they also had about the same number of people who were sustained responders at 12 weeks. But this is remarkable in this area, very difficult to treat depression, people who are suffering for a long time. So we're just scratching the surface of why would someone not respond? Why would somebody respond? And until we get deeper into that answer, I think we need to really be cautious, because it isn't a panacea. It shouldn't be put in the water supply. And I think this is a really big issue for all of us, of how do we tamp down a little bit of the expectation and really follow the science and do large trials. And that's where we're headed next, is to do a very large, what's called phase 3 trial. And we're in discussion with regulators about that for later in the year.
Right. Interesting. I had a very long career with psilocybin on the recreational side, which I came to believe was so effective in answering so many internal questions that I like to think of myself of having morphed from a recreational mindset to more of a sort of self-discovery mindset, and where I was observing myself. And that was one of the great things about psilocybin, is it gave me the ability to project my perception from a third-party perspective, and made me see the ridiculousness of clinging to thoughts that were negative, and that were very much of my own construction and only existed because of my own support. So I was really interested to find that I had to experiment with different dosages. So my lead up to that is in questioning the lack of a response from the 75% group. I mean, fantastic that a single dose is going to put people in a remissive state after one dose, but it's entirely acceptable in my view, and hopefully in the clinical community's view, that some people might need a little bit more, not necessarily heavier dosage, but maybe more of a tailored dose or a repeated dose to loosen up certain metaphysical frameworks in the mind.
Well, I think first of all, you're so blessed in a way, James, because you don't suffer from treatment-resistant depression, right? And so psychedelics are referred to as mind manifesting. And if you're really in a desperate state where nothing has worked for you, and you encounter one of these trials and you think this is going to be the cure, you have high expectations. And people going into the trial, if it's mind manifesting and all they can see is despair and hopelessness, that's what can manifest. So it's quite a different experience for people who are suffering from severe mental illness than someone who is healthy trying to, I like to say, recreate. So a recreational experience, you're trying to recreate something about your life as a healthy person.
Right.
And so I think it's a really important cautionary tale in a way. Now, The reason we did only one dose is super simple. COMPASS, our true north at COMPASS, is evidence, evidence, evidence. And what we found is that there were no studies before that really looked at how long would a single dose last. And until we know that, then we can't figure out who needs a second dose. How might that work? Do you give people who don't have a response a second dose, or do you only use that to maintain the people who did respond? And so what's beautiful too about this work is that when you provide psilocybin, unlike almost any other medicine, at least any other medicine I'm familiar with in depression, you know the day after whether someone's going to respond. If they don't respond on day 2, they're not going to respond on week 1.
Right.
And it's remarkable. So that gives us the ability to think about, well, how do we handle those folks? Because with a traditional antidepressant, it's usually 12 weeks before whether you know if the first dose or an increased dose will work for you. So this just is a paradigm shift and really remarkable promise for patients, but we have to follow the data.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Definitely the next day should be a new day in more ways than one, at least from my experience. And good point about, obviously not having the basis of a, clinical resistant depression or treatment-resistant depression. I mean, yes, I've always been fortunate enough to come at it with a more or less optimistic and happy place. So, but I think that is because I was fortunate enough to be exposed to psychedelics from a very young age, and I really credit psychedelic experience with the ability of at least the elasticity in my perception to, like, my first reaction to adverse circumstances mentally is not fear, it's not dread, it's not hopelessness or despair. It's always hopeful curiosity and interest and willingness to face it straight on, because exposure to psilocybin, especially in large doses, brings you face to face with these mental images, which are originated in the mind, that you nonetheless are forced to, you can't run, you can't flee from them. So they cause you to, like, at the end of the trip, you realize that, wow, that was some scary stuff, but I could, whatever you manifest is what you manifested. I talked to it, I laughed with it, we danced together, whatever it is. But so anyways, I don't want to convey to the audience that it's recommendable in any way, shape, or form to go off experimenting on psychedelics on your own if you're not predisposed to do so and have a history of doing so. So I think that to me, it's just, I wish that the world would move a little faster, and that, I think in high schools there should be an availability, a pathway, a COMPASS pathway for students who are struggling internally, to say, hey, if you're struggling internally with depression, or you think you might be depressed, or you're having thoughts of, self-destructive thoughts, here's a route for you to go and explore, and a program for you to go into. And I just think that would be so beneficial to so many kids at that vulnerable age where, teen suicide is its own category.
And James, I think that this is part of the long-term vision, but we also, long-term vision in terms of, there are so many adolescents who are suffering. And so, part of what each regulator asks is, how do we help that group? And so we're looking very carefully at the safety, how we might work with that group as part of what the FDA refers to as a pediatric plan. Now, remember, everything that we're doing is in the lane of working to transform mental health at scale for people who are really suffering. We go after the hard stuff. There's a whole other lane that you've talked about, which other people have experienced. I've had experiences, I've mentioned in prior interviews, which have been like yours. But the risk for people who are really suffering is it's dangerous. And the reason we have regulation is simply so that we know who can benefit and who can't, and we're not making claims to vulnerable people. And that's the path that we're on, is to generate that evidence to the highest standard for governments around the world, so people do have access to this powerful tool, first to really help with serious mental illness. And the question is, when do you stop making someone better?
George, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I really enjoy our conversations, and I can't wait for the next one. Congratulations on all your success, and I hope you the best in the future. Thanks for your time today.
You bet, James. Thanks so much. Love watching the fish tank.
You bet. Bye for now. They're making progress, but obviously COMPASS has been the victim of a sell-off since November of last year, and has essentially lost over half of its value since this spike back here in November 2021. Now, obviously, the speculative trade has gone out of COMPASS Pathways, and this is very typical of a biotech company that has sort of made its discovery, demonstrated early efficacy, achieved some regulatory approvals, and is now, basically investors are saying, we'll come back when there's some money being made. And at this point, they're still in the research and development phase, so that's not going to happen for quite a while yet. I think their last reported loss was 11 cents a share, but all of the psychedelics are down. If I come out of this is my list of psychedelics companies. So COMPASS Pathways down. This is a company, Red Light, that obviously sold off from a high of 62. It's lost basically 3/4 of its value at this point. Field Trip is one of my favorites. Now, this one also has sold off like crazy from its high of around $7 here, now trading at $2. We've had Ronan Levy, the CEO, on, and we'll continue to follow this story. We think this is one of the best ones. Numinous Ventures, or Numinous Wellness rather, is one of the exceptions. It seems to be rising in share price lately, touching a new high today at 68 cents in 2022. But most of the stocks are down in the sector, and that's because we're in this period where it's all research and development and nobody's really making any money yet. Anyways, there's my show for today. Hope you liked it. Don't forget to write jwest@midasletter.com. We'll see you tomorrow and every day. We've got more great guests coming this week. Thanks for watching.